Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the eighth episode of our Tool Talk series covering the launch of our newest open source tool, ASM Inject. I'm Joe Seckman, AVP of R&D here at Bishop Fox, and joining me today is the author of ASM Inject, Ben Lincoln. Now, some of you may remember Ben from episode 6, where he discussed debugging Ruby exploits. If you missed that episode, I highly recommend checking it out. Ben, over to you. Please take a moment to introduce yourself.
Hi, Joe. Great to talk to you again. I'm a managing senior consultant at Bishop Fox, so I lead a team of consultants as well as performing offensive security work myself. I'm a jack of all trades, but I specialize in reverse engineering, application security, and network or organization level penetration tests. I've worked in security for 11 years, and before that I did systems engineering and development work.
Excellent. Well, hey, thanks for joining me again here for our next tool talk. But before we dive into the live demo of ASM Inject, wanted to talk a little bit about how the tool works. Well, I guess more specifically, what problem is ASM Inject trying to solve?
So an elevator pitch for the tool might be a tool for tampering with Linux processes while avoiding detection by monitoring software. We wrote it with a few goals in mind. So we wanted to give operators the ability to inject code into processes without the tool attaching as a debugger. We'll talk more about that later in the talk. We wanted to provide a way to easily cause those processes to take actions that they wouldn't normally perform, but that are close enough to normal behavior that security monitoring software hopefully wouldn't catch them. Specifically, in addition to any other payloads, we wanted to be able to inject new script code into an existing process that was using the same interpreter. So new PHP code in an existing PHP process, Ruby and Python and so forth. And then finally, make it easy to reference functions in shared libraries that the target process already has loaded, even if the process is running inside a container and the ASM inject script isn't, or if they're running in different containers.
Okay, all right. Well, I've got a couple other questions for you, but I think first what I'd like to do is cut over to the live demo and take a look at the tool and introduce the audience to it.
I've got a Python script running on an Ubuntu VM that simulates a cyclic batch process. It waits for files to show up in a queue directory, processes them, and then moves the files to an output directory as a record of the work that was performed. In other words, it's perfectly normal for this script to access the input and output files all day, every day. If I use another terminal window to create a file in the input directory, you can see that the script performs that work. Big businesses typically use this model to handle things like payment card settlement, business-to-business file transfer, and so forth. I'll start out with a very basic example of injecting new Python code into that existing script process using ASM Inject. I found the process ID, I'm using the payload that injects Python code, and I'm injecting a basic print operation. When I execute the command, ASM Inject will wait for the script process to enter a syscall. Once that happens, it injects the payload. Because it's not attaching as a debugger, I could do this even if I were running the script process in GDB. Over in the script window, you can see that the print operation wrote the output to the console, and then the script continued operating normally. That's kind of neat as a proof of concept, but as a security consultant, I want to demonstrate potential business impact. I'll launch a Netcat listener on my Kali machine to simulate a file upload web application sitting on the internet, and I'll write a more complex inner payload as a full Python script. This Python code walks through all of the output subdirectories and uploads any files it finds there. The ASM Inject syntax for this is almost identical, except that I point it to a file for the Python script code instead of specifying that script code directly in the command. In the script window, the injected code has found a file to upload. Over on the Kali system, you can see the name and empty content for that test file I created earlier. The upload script I wrote is single-threaded, so I'll kill the Netcat listener and restart it, and then the script sends the next file, which contains a bunch of credit card data. By doing this via a trusted process, I'm bypassing any transparent disk encryption and less likely to trigger alerts because the batch process reading these files is perfectly normal. Once the upload is complete, the script goes back to its normal activities, just like with the print statement.
Okay, well, that was fascinating. And I think I'll start with one of my favorite questions that I feel is always important at the release of a new tool, and that is, what prompted you to create ASM Inject?
So the short answer is that we wanted to provide a tool that would demonstrate ways to bypass ineffective monitoring software instead of asking the clients that we were working with to take it on faith that they could be bypassed. So it makes me nervous when people depend on security controls that make it harder for an attacker in some unquantifiable way. But I've been on the other side of those discussions, and I know that it can just as easily seem like it's the security team that's making unfair assumptions. And if we have a working tool, it eliminates that ambiguity.
Yeah.
The longer version is that about 18 months ago, we performed an assessment where an organization wanted to process sensitive data in Linux containers, but also prevent access to that data by users who had administrative access to the hosts where the containers were running. I won't be talking more about that specific assessment to protect the client confidentiality, but a hypothetical equivalent might be an intelligence agency that wanted to prevent their system administrators from accessing field data that their officers had uploaded for analysis. In a perfect world, the system admins would have permission to run the infrastructure, but not view that sensitive data unless they were authorized to work with it. The client had included a third-party security agent in their container images, and if the agent detected suspicious activity by one of those trusted processes, it would basically shut it down and prevent it from accessing that sensitive data, dump all of it from memory, and so forth. So part of that assessment was looking at the agent itself to try to find ways to exploit it. But for me, the more interesting part of it was assuming that the agent itself was more or less flawless, and was there a way to access the data without tampering with the agent at all. That wasn't a big assumption because the agent was actually written very well. It was hardened. It was designed to make reverse engineering difficult in pretty much every way you can imagine. The vendor of that product was an active part of the discussion, and they specifically mentioned that they wanted to prevent tampering with those trusted processes by having the agent attached to them as a sort of faux debugger. So on most operating systems, you can only have one debugger attached to a process at a time. And so if the monitoring agent connected to its own processes, that would prevent some other tool from connecting. Now, attaching that way is basically the nice way of tampering with the process, but typically an administrator could at least theoretically cause the same effect just by writing over whatever's in memory for that process. And even if someone theoretically came up with a way to block it at the operating system level, someone could do the same thing with a hardware attack using something like a PCI leech. So we wanted to demonstrate the software version of that attack, but felt like it would also illustrate that having access at that higher level than the security tool would work as well at the physical level. Because the operation was basically the same. It's just how you're writing over memory. Most of the tools for tampering with processes like Frida attach using the debugging interface, even if they only do it for a moment. We found a handful of tools that didn't, but the only one that we actually got to work at the time was David Buchanan's DL-inject, which ended up forming the core of asminject. During the assessment, we modified it enough to prove our point, but it seemed like an interesting enough line of research that after the assessment concluded, we wanted to go back to the unmodified DL-inject and build a real production-grade general-purpose tool. There was another important aspect to that agent, which it actively managed trust down to the level of the binaries and even script-level libraries that were loaded by the trusted processes. So, for example, we started out by injecting code that inserted libc calls to try to copy sensitive data around, and those were rejected because that library was not on the trust list. So we had to inject script code that was written in the same language as the interpreter for the process, and didn't load any additional script level libraries, but still copied the sensitive data out for us. That was a lot of work to demo during that assessment, but asminject makes that easy now. And we felt like that approach could be useful for other folks in similar situations, but also people like red team operators who are trying to be as unsuspicious as possible and blend in with whatever is going on already.
Yeah, that's a fascinating use case, and I think maybe taking this one step back a little bit, we had the link up there for where to go find asminject on bishopfox.com. Curious, what does interested folks from the audience need to run asminject? What kind of system dependencies or requirements are necessary?
So today they need a Linux system running on x86, x86-64, or ARM32 hardware. We're planning to add support for ARM64 or AArch64 as well. To run the script itself, you need a reasonably modern version of Python, although in terms of payloads, you can target very old versions of Python. in addition to the other supported script languages. And there are a couple of third-party Python libraries that need to be installed using pip. Nothing super unusual there. And finally, they need the ability to read and write memory for the target process. The easiest way to get that is typically by being root, but there may be other options depending on how the system's configured.
Okay, excellent. So for our audience as well, and also available on bishoppucks.com, is the technical guide that accompanies the release of ASM Inject. One of the areas in reviewing the technical guide that I thought was very interesting is the mention of Bruce Schneier. How does Bruce Schneier apply to ASM Inject?
When we went to frame the discussion with our clients about that original assessment, everyone that we talked to within Bishop Fox agreed with this generalized statement that we came up with, which was basically a process can never be completely protected against an attacker with a higher level of access to the same system, or some higher level of the system. So whether it's root access on the host versus a container, or physical access to the device versus the software that's running on it. But we couldn't find any sort of computer science theory to back this up that we could refer to by name. And we did a lot of reading. The closest we found was a piece that Bruce Schneier wrote in 2001 called "The Futility of Digital Copy Protection," the Futility of Digital Copy Prevention. That was one of the earliest refutations of digital rights management. So essentially, his point was that if someone can watch a video, listen to a piece of music, or read a text publication, there's a way for them to make a copy of that media. DRM might make it really, really hard to copy, but there's no way to prevent it entirely. And that seemed like a pretty solid parallel with what we were trying to achieve.
Excellent. Now, I also remember way back when you were first embarking on this research, there was a term that was used to describe kind of the project. And the term, which is also in the technical guide as well, deceitful God in the machine. Where did that reference come from, and what exactly does that mean?
So even though we couldn't find a name for this concept in computer science, having read some philosophical works in the past, I'd read about Rene Descartes' thought experiments about what he called an evil demon or a deceiving God. His argument was that if a person's perception of the world around them is being controlled, then the malicious entity can cause that person to believe and do whatever the entity wants them to do, and the person is effectively helpless unless the entity makes some kind of mistake. So basically, the entity is in that inherently superior position, just like the attacker who has root access versus the container. And of course, this formed the basis for a lot of film and television over the years. To differentiate the idea in our write-up from Descartes, I wanted to make it more obvious that we were discussing computing systems. But I thought that tying the reference to Deus Ex Machina had some nice symmetry, because the resulting tool basically comes out of nowhere to solve the operator's core problem, whether that's from the perspective of the target process being mysteriously altered, or a pen tester thinking, wouldn't it be neat if there were a tool that did this, and then discovering that it already exists.
Yeah. Excellent. That's just fascinating. The whole aspects of this tool is just beyond fascinating, and I encourage everyone to go take a look at that technical guide that accompanies this tool release. Now, early we talked about the system requirements, and we were mentioning Linux specific aspects of it. Can or will other operating systems be supported by ASM Inject?
Right now, my focus is going to be on supporting Linux, but it should be possible for someone to either add support for Windows if they were interested, or create a similar tool for Windows. As far as I know, Windows doesn't have an equivalent of one of the specific mechanisms that ASM Inject and DL Inject use, which is being able to watch for when a process enters a syscall, so that they can then overwrite whatever it's going to jump back to once it completes. There's an alternative approach that's used elsewhere, where instead of just overwriting whatever that code happens to be, you'd overwrite a known function like printf, for example, and then wait for the application to call it for some other reason. That support isn't in there today, but it would be useful on Linux as well as Windows, just to give it some additional flexibility. The other significant work would be writing Windows equivalents of all of the assembly payloads. And that would be more work. It wouldn't quite be starting over in terms of the assembly, but it would be close, just because Linux and Windows work so differently at the level where that code is running.
Okay, excellent. So do you have any closing thoughts or remarks, or words of advice and guidance to the audience for using and running ASM Inject?
Oh, good question. I'm just really happy to see it out there. It seems like there's a lot of potential there. We've already found some interesting use cases for it, like injecting into PyInstaller binary executables and then extracting and decompiling the Python code from inside of those. So that's a common technique that some people try to use to obfuscate their code, and is a way to just completely step around that in most cases. So yeah, definitely interested to see what uses people come up with for it, and yeah, happy to hear any feedback.
Excellent. Well, Ben, thank you so much for joining me today. And also thanks to our audience for joining us to be part of the ASM Inject launch. As I mentioned, we've also published a technical guide detailing many of the topics that we discussed today. And there's much more available on bishopfox.com. So please check it out. As always, if there are any questions that you think of after our live stream here, please reach out to us through our social channels or directly. Ben or myself will be happy to answer. So once again, thank you so much for everyone, and we'll see you soon. Have a great day.
All right. Thanks again, Joe.